Gamers, start your engines. Aetherdrift is here, and today I'm going to be going over my cube first impressions from Magic's newest release. Before I get into things, I want to go over the format for today's video. It's something I'm trying out, something new. When a new set came out, I used to do my list of the top 10 most cubable cards. I wrote those kind of articles for a couple years, and those were my first couple of videos on new releases lately. But today, I'm not doing a top 10. I'm just going to be going over largely cards that I will be cubing with from Aetherdrift. So I'm going to cover the set's themes, some of the most notable cards, but my specific focus is going to be cards that are going into my cubes. So I have a couple cards up here: Duretti Rocketeer Engineer, Ketramos the New Dawn, Loot the Pathfinder. I think these are some of the most significant cards for other people's cubes, but I personally do not intend to cube with them, so these are some examples of cards that I'm not going to be talking about today. So let's go ahead and get to the themes of the set and the cards I will be talking about. One of the major themes in Aetherdrift is a cycling / discard matters sort of thing. There's quite a lot of cards with cycling, and then cards that pay you off whenever you discard a card, so it naturally pairs very well in retail limited with cycling, and then it goes into discard matters or a madness archetype for something like a cube. Madness / discard matters is one of the major themes in my spooky cube, and all four of these cards are going to make their way there: Scrounging Skyray, Marauding Mako, Waxen Shape Thief, and Monument to Endurance. Scrounging Skyray and Marauding Mako are some nice, cheap, scalable threats. They're going to play really well with discard outlets. They're just going to show up early and then grow large over time, allowing you to apply pressure to your opponent as you discard cards for value. I think Marauding Mako looks more powerful on its surface just because it only costs 1 mana, but I do believe that Scrounging Skyray is slightly more powerful in that environment and in a lot of cubes that have this discard matters themes, just for that evasion. You're willing to pay 2 mana for something that's harder to block. It's not hard to come by chump blockers in a lot of cubes, and Spooky Cube's not going to be an exception there, so evasion on this kind of threat really is quite a big deal. Waxen Shape Thief does have cycling, so it kind of fits in this space. Really, it's going into that cube because there's a lot of clones in that environment. It more plays with the human matters theme, stuff like Thalia's Lieutenant and other human lords, but I just have it here because I didn't want to have a ton of slides and spend a ton of time talking about individual cards. I'm trying to make these things a little bit more streamlined, so that's why I have that card featured here. And then Monument to Endurance is more transparently just a nice card to put in an environment that has a lot of discard matters, a lot of cycling. This one can go pretty crazy. I think specifically that ability to draw a card once per turn whenever you discard a card is really important for making a discard matters archetype really work. Sources of card advantage, stuff like Squee, Goblin, Nabob, just things that make up the card disadvantage of cards like Frantic Search and Faithless Looting, really go a long way if you're trying to support this kind of theme, so I'm quite excited to try out Monument to Endurance. A new keyword in Aetherdrift is Exhaust. Exhaust just means that the ability can only be used once. Not per turn, just once. Once you activate that ability has been exhausted and you can no longer use it. Couple different cards here. Technically, Exhaust is a theme in Aetherdrift. There are some cards that trigger whenever you use an Exhaust ability, some cards that let you use Exhaust abilities multiple times. For my purposes, the cards I'm looking at, they really are just cards that have Exhaust abilities. The first is Draconautics Engineer. I think that this is just a solid card for the original recipe Tubert, just a nice grizzly bear with some extra text. I really like having cheap threats that have a mana sink here, and both abilities here giving other creatures haste, notably also growing itself when you do that, and just making a 4/4 dragon as the game goes long, really appealing in a mid-range environment. Grease-Wrenched Goblin is a card that I picked up several copies of. I think that the biggest difference that this card is going to make for my cubes is once again the original recipe Tubert. For a long time, I struggled to find red 1-drops that were really worth playing in a mid-range environment. I had Zurgo Bellstriker for a long time, and it's just not really a card as the game goes long, whereas Grease-Wrenched Goblin is great on turn 1, and then you have this card selection ability, and the fact that it grows itself a little bit to allow it to stay relevant as the game does go long. So I like this one quite a lot, and it's going to allow me to jump from 2 red 1-drops to 3 red 1-drops in that cube, which I think goes a long way in expressing red's color identity, allowing the red decks to be a bit more aggressive, which should be pretty dynamic and fun to play in that cube. Stampeding Scurryfoot isn't anything too special. It's a very similar shape to the card Mild-Mannered Librarian, which has technically an exhaust ability, but it's not an exhaust ability, so it doesn't synergize with other exhaust cards. Anyway, it's a 1-mana green creature with a 4-mana ability you can only use once. The Scurryfoot grows a little larger and gives you a 3/3. This is not going to find a home in too many cubes. I am specifically putting this one in the 1-bert. I have not made any videos or written any articles about that cube just yet, but it is a 2-bert where all of the spells have mana value 1. So this kind of cheap creature that has this ability to be a mana sink and have a big payoff later in the game fits well in that environment. This could also be nice for like a Pauper cube. It's not going into mine, but it's some food for thought. And lastly, there's Sky Serpent Seeker. Just a 2-mana 1/1 flying Death Touch is decent in quite a lot of cubes. You know, the power level of cards these days, just blocking, it's not that appealing, so it's not going to fit into a ton of cubes. This is not on the power level for the original recipe 2-bert, but it's definitely going into my Peasant 2-bert, being an uncommon. This is a nice value creature. I do think I'm going to try it out in the Spooky Cube. A Death Touch blocker definitely can fit into the spider spawning kind of strategy, so I'll see how it fits there. But it is a nice value card. It could certainly fit into a lot of mid-power level cubes. The most significant theme in Aetherdrift is going to be vehicles and mounts, and you do see a number of cards that actually reference both vehicles and mounts in this set, whereas previously we've had some vehicles matters, we've seen some stuff for mounts, but Aetherdrift is a set that's saying, alright, these mechanics are very similar, let's introduce some cards that really bridge the gap. So if you want to build a cube that is like a set cube or something that's really themed after Aetherdrift, there's a number of cards in that space that I think are going to be really valuable, that are going to make something like that possible. For my purposes, I'm really just looking at some of the individual cards to go into some of my cubes, so I'm not exploring this so much as a theme as I am looking at individual cards. The first of which is the Last Ride, the Death Shadow car. So I have a Death Shadows theme in the Tempo 2-bert. I'm going to give the Last Ride a try. I have done one draft with it in the cube already. I don't think anybody played it, so we're gonna keep watching that one. I do like the fact that you can just cast the Last Ride even before it would be a creature, unlike Death Shadow. So you can just have it on the battlefield, maybe even use that ability to pay life to draw some cards, and then when it's on, you just crew it and you can attack right away. So there's some appeal there. It is, I think, generally weaker than Death Shadow, but there's only so many cards that play in that space, so it is nice archetypal support. Cryptcaller Chariot is a vehicle, but it's actually just another discard matters card. Maybe it should have been on that slide. That one's going in Spooky Cube. Make zombies. I used to support that as a creature type. I still have a little bit of that going on. I think I have Cryptbreaker and Gravecrawler, so there's something going on there, but mostly this is another nice discard matters card. Much like Boosted Sloop, actually also going into Spooky Cube. Yes, another vehicle with some discard matters. What I really like about Boosted Sloop is that it's just whenever you attack, you draw a card and then discard a card. So you don't need to attack with the Sloop. You cast the Boosted Sloop, and then any creatures you already have in play, they can attack, let you loot. If you have your Marauding Mako or whatever, you can just grow them right away in conjunction with the Sloop. Definitely a synergy in Aetherdrift Limited, definitely a synergy in Spooky Cube, and one that I think could fit into quite a lot of cubes if you were interested in exploring that space. And lastly, I have Debris Beetle. This is kind of a mid-range card. Its stats are large. Maybe to some players it looks stronger than Siege Rhino, and the fact that it's green-black and not the full Abzan, it does make it more castable. The fact that it's a vehicle and not just a creature, it actually is a bit weaker than Siege Rhino. So I'm not trying this out in the original recipe 2-bert as like a mid-range kind of card. I'm trying this out specifically as an artifact in the Artifact 2-bert that did not previously have an artifact in the green-black slot. So just increasing the volume of artifacts in that cube is largely what I'm doing with this card. But I do think it has some appeal as just a nice enters ability, a giant creature to attack. That one I do expect to show up in more cubes just as a card. Speaking of the Artifact 2-bert, Artifacts Matter is also just a more broad theme in Aetherdrift. It's not just vehicles, there's also support for assorted trinkets. All 6 cards pictured here, they are going into the Artifact 2-bert, and they call out artifacts in some way, or are meaningfully an artifact in space that had less support previously. Sundial Dawn Tyrant is not the most exciting card. It is one of the vanilla legends for the set, but it has an exception compared to the rest of them. It is an artifact creature. A 2-mana 3/3, Watchwolf hasn't been able to cut it for years, but it's a gold card. And it's not an artifact. So we're going to try that one in the artifact tubert. There's a lot of white modular creatures from Modern Horizons 2 that I think are going to play quite well with it. And it just has good stats. It's larger than a lot of creatures as a baseline in that environment, so I'm kind of excited for it. Memory Guardian, kind of in similar space. We see Affinity here showing up on that, and Demonic Junker. The Junker and Grim Bauble are quite appealing in that they are artifacts that are removal spells. So I think that's going to add some disruption to the environment, make it a little bit more interactable, while keeping up a very high volume of the cards being artifacts, which is very appealing to me for that environment. Repurposing Bay, the artifact birthing pod. I'm not super sure how that one's going to play out, but I do have a Quark Clan Ironworks deck kind of seeded into the cube, so I can see it making big waves in that kind of shell. It remains to be seen how it's going to play out. You do need a high volume of artifact support there, but like I've been saying about every card to this point for that cube, I have it in that environment, so I'm really excited to see how that one works out. Then there's Marketback Walker, a card in the line of Walking Ballista and Hangerback Walker. This one's a bit slow to grow, and it only has a death trigger. I think it's fairly modest, certainly relative to Walking Ballista. You can make an argument that it's stronger than Hangerback Walker, but I think that it largely plays in the same space as Hangerback Walker. You want to be synergizing with some combination of artifacts, +1/+1 counters, and a sacrifice theme, just some way to make it die. I expect Marketback Walker to do a lot of chump blocking. Maybe you can get it up to a 2/2 or a 3/3 and make some scary attacks to pressure your opponent's life total, but largely you're going to be using this one, I believe, to generate card advantage. It can certainly show up in more mid-range environments or just any cube that's looking to fill a colorless slot, but I specifically like it when artifacts matter and when +1/+1 counters matter. So something like the Proliferate cube curated by Carmen Klomperens, or the Artifact Tubert also has a Hardened Scales theme, so it just makes a lot of sense in that cube. And that brings us to the most ambitious aspect of the Aetherdrift design, the Start Your Engines or Speed ability, a new emblem-based ability that I will say is easier to track and manage than I think anything we've really seen in this space. It does introduce an emblem, but I think it's pretty manageable and generally pretty easy to track and understand. When you resolve a Start Your Engines ability, you go from having no speed, it's not a thing that exists, it's not a thing that tracks, you go to 1 speed. Then, every turn, on your turn, the first time your opponent loses life, you increment your speeds. You go from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. It's not going to increment when you play another Start Your Engines ability. It's just going to be the first time your opponent loses life on each of your turns. And then your max speed is 4. And then all your Start Your Engines cards are going to have some kind of buff when you hit max speed. And then your speed's just going to stay at 4. Really, in a game of Magic, outside of Aetherdraft Retail Limited, I don't think you're going to see speed change in any way other than what's printed on the card. Meaningfully, you can't proliferate speed, which is maybe a little bit weird, a little unintuitive. I'm not super excited about that aspect in the Artifact Tubert, where I do have some proliferate cards, but we'll see how headachy it ends up being in practice. I have 2 cubes that I'm going to try a Start Your Engines package in. The first is the Onebert, that all 1 mana value cube that I alluded to earlier. I'm going to try out Gas Guzzler, Burnout, Bastronaut, Light Wheel Enhancements, and Nesting Bot. And this is actually every 1-drop in the set that has Start Your Engines. It just makes sense that when you have cards that care about speed, that have a payoff when you have max speed, you want as many Start Your Engines cards as possible. Not because casting a second one increments your speed, that's not how it works, but because you want to get your speed going as early as possible so that when you draw the payoff that really matters, or, if the first one that you draw does Start Your Engines meaningfully and you want to trigger that max speed, you really just want to have it happen as early as possible. So if you have Gas Guzzler in your deck, it's going to benefit you to have Nesting Bot in your deck, because then you're just that much more likely to have the Start Your Engines go on your first turn, and you're working towards that 4 speed so that you can use the Gas Guzzler ability to start sacrificing creatures to draw cards. Nesting Bot specifically, I think, is going to be the glue. I think any cube that's looking at supporting speed is going to be looking at that card, and that's also going to be going into my Artifact Tubert, along with Mendicant, Core, and Guidelight, Perilous Snare, and Muruganda Raceway. Some lanes are a little bit more experimental. Perilous Snare is a little bit slow. Muruganda Raceway, mostly gets a pass in that environment because a colorless land is kind of fine to have. That's not going to be true in a lot of cubes, but the big payoff there is going to be Mendicant. This is just an awesome blue-white creature that has a built-in cranial plating, and when you hit max speed, you can start doubling all of your artifact spells. That's a really strong Signpost gold card. I really love it. I'm very excited to cube with that card. And having a little bit more start your engines, a little bit more speed support, I believe is pretty important to actually facilitating it. Though if you do have an artifact theme, you could just toss that card into your cube. I like pushing things. I want to see just how much speed is palatable, how fun it is. And I'll get a feel for how many total Start Your Engines cards I want in an environment over time. But my intuition is that you kind of want as much as you could realistically support from the point that you have one, if for no other reason than that it does become pretty irritating to track speed if you no longer have any use for hitting maximum speed. So that's just another reason that I think it's pretty important to have multiple Start Your Engines cards in an environment. That's all the major themes and mechanics of Aetherdrift. There are still a few cards worth discussing. The first is Stock Up. This is a really powerful card selection card that asks nothing of you. It's kind of in the space of Dig Through Time. It is a sorcery, not an instant, but you don't have to use your graveyard. So you can just kind of put this anywhere, and it's going to give you a lot of looks towards whatever you're looking for. This one's going into my Peasant Tubert. I'm keeping my eyes open for where I might want to try it otherwise. I think it's a little bit weak for a 360 card vintage cube, so it's not going into my vintage cube, but I do think it's a very good fit for a 540 card vintage cube, for example, and just anywhere that either is looking for generic card selection or has a Spells Matter theme. Depending on the power level of your cube, depending on how much playing to the battlefield matters, I think anywhere where you're really caring about instants and sorceries, Stock Up can be a very good fit. And also, if your cube has a lot of combo elements, anywhere you're trying to assemble A, B, C, Stock Up is a lot of looks towards making that happen. Aganosaur Rex is technically a discard matter card. You know, it has cycling. It could have been on my cycling slide, but it's going into the original recipe Tubert just because it's a 5-mana 8/8 trample. I do like having the cycling ability there as something that can show up as a neat combat trick. I think introducing more of that to really about any cube kind of enhances the gameplay. Anywhere where creatures are attacking and blocking and tricks can matter, I think is quite fun. So getting a little bit more of that there makes sense to me. I've been cubing with Overlord of the Hauntwoods there, and it really hasn't performed as well as I had hoped in the original recipe Tubert. So a creature that's a little bit larger, and an ability I think that plays a little bit more in a cube that's about establishing your battlefield presence early, trying to get some meaningful attacks out there. I think Aganosaur Rex is going to play better in that environment. Aetherdrift is also introducing a couple of very meaningful cycles for cube. The ally-colored Gearhulks that are double pipped in both of their colors all have really strong enters abilities. For me, these cards all fall a little bit shy of making it into a 360 card vintage cube, so again, they won't be making it into my vintage cube, but I could see a case for all 5 of them in a 540 card vintage cube, and really these are kind of legacy cube power level cards. If you have a legacy cube that's just looking for generic cards, all 5 of these are worth a look. If you have an artifact theme, they become even more appealing. And I will say that Bright Glass Gearhulk is the one that's kind of knocking on the door of the artifact Tubert. The thing that's kind of holding me back from trying it is the green, white casting cost. But it is an artifact, so I'm thinking about it. There's a very good chance that I do end up trying the card. It just, for me, mostly these cards are a little bit too much rate, a little bit too little synergy, so they're not making it into my cubes, but I do expect them to see a lot of cube play in other cubes. Certainly the more generic your cube is, the larger your cube is, the more you're going to be looking at all 5 of these cards, which are quite strong in their color pairs. And then there is the completion of the Verge cycle. I don't currently have Verges in any of my cubes. I'm kind of checking them out. What's kind of interesting to me about Verges is that if you look at all of the 10 Verges that we have, if you look at any individual color, so you say a River Pyre Verge is the blue-red Verge here. The other Verge that starts on red taps for green, and so you have red-green, which is an ally color pair, and you have red-blue, which is an enemy color pair, and then all together you get red-blue-green, which is Teamer, which is an enemy wedge. So one ally, one enemy, building to a wedge. That's consistent across all 10 of the Verges for all 5 colors. So I have been kind of thinking what space it makes sense to put these in. To me, it makes sense to put these in an environment where you really are valuing one color as a primary color over the other. And so your Sunbillow Verge, for example, is going to go into a white deck that wants white mana on turn 1, is going to want red mana more for a splash or as the game progresses. But these are just strong untapped lands. Wouldn't bat an eye at seeing them in any cube. Certainly if your cube is larger, if we're talking about a 540 card cube, whatever. Again, you know, most of my cubes are 180 cards. My vintage cube is 360 cards. They're not quite cutting it for me there without specifically having a reason to want these. You know, they're not better than Shocklands. They're not better than original duels. But the larger your cube is, or the more you're in the space where that color imbalance matters, these are quite appealing, so I do expect these to be cubed quite a lot. And I'll be looking for an opportunity to cube with them myself. I have been thinking about how to map out a cube that really cares about these color pairs, that supports an enemy color set ultimately. And that's going to do it for my Aetherdrift first impressions. Let me know in the comments how you felt about this video, how you felt about this new format as I look at new sets for Magic. There's a ton of them coming up this year and every year, so I'm moving away from that top 10 list. Let me know what you liked about what you saw here, maybe what you didn't like, what you would have rather seen, and what you'd like to see in the future. Hit me up in the comments, and thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.